Hello, and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Here's what we're looking at. The city's Inspector General says the police department's investigation of officers with extremist ties is materially deficient.
Funding cures most of the ills that all of you and the public have spoken about.
And transit leaders push back at the first public hearing on a proposed merger. Our Spotlight Politics team on that and more. And now to some of today's top stories. Governor J.B. Pritzker is telling reporters he, too, stands behind President Joe Biden to serve as the Democratic nominee for president. But he agrees it is fair for some, including the media, to question Biden's ability to complete the race.
Sure, I think that President Biden, and I've said this, he needs to go out there and answer all the questions. And he needs to show people that he is the leader of the free world and that he's doing a heck of a job of making sure that the United States is leading us. We have a lot of enemies in the world, and it is going to take a tough, strong, smart, and principled leader, and that's what Joe Biden is.
Meanwhile, members of Congress are arriving back in D.C. On the agenda, private meetings among the Democratic caucus in both the House and the Senate. While some party leaders have said they'll continue to support Biden to be the Democratic nominee, Illinois Congressman Mike Quigley is doubling down today on his stance that it's time for Biden to step aside.
You know, the fighting spirit and pride and courage that served the country so well 4 years ago, helped Joe Biden win, will bring the ticket down this time. He just has to step down because he can't win. And my colleagues need to recognize that a dismissive letter is not going to change any minds.
Quigley is referring to the letter that Biden sent to congressional Democrats expressing his plans to stay in the race. And of course, the Republican National Convention happens in Milwaukee next week. Our Spotlight Politics team will have a look ahead at that in just a few minutes. Convicted former Alderman Ed Burke's city pension was yanked just minutes after his sentencing. According to records obtained by WTTW News, the pension fund's executive director, Tiffany Junkins, directed her staff to stop Burke's $8,000 a month pension payment just 30 minutes after his sentencing. Burke was sentenced last month to 2 years in prison after being convicted on federal corruption charges. He's scheduled to report to prison in September. The 4 former ComEd executives convicted of conspiring to bribe Michael Madigan will ask a federal judge to toss out their convictions, citing a recent ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court. In a 6-3 decision last month, the court redefined the federal bribery statute to mean that gratuities or payments made in recognition of actions already taken by an elected official without a quid pro quo agreement in place are not subject to that law. Attorneys for the so-called ComEd 4 argue the ruling would require their 2023 convictions to be tossed out in favor of a new trial. Federal prosecutors argue the charges in this case remain unchanged and a new trial therefore isn't necessary. Up next, one-on-one with the city's Inspector General about her demands to look into officers with extremist ties. That's right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
The Chicago Police Department's most recent investigation into officers with ties to a far-right extremist group was, quote, materially deficient. That's according to Chicago Inspector General Deborah Witzburg, who asked that investigations into 8 officers with ties to the far-right group, the Oath Keepers, be reopened. But CPD leadership has rejected her request. Joining us now to tell us more is Chicago Inspector General Deborah Witzburg. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So your report found that the CPD's investigation of officers with ties to far-right extremist groups conducted by the Bureau of Internal Affairs, as we said, was, quote, materially deficient. What were the ways that you think the investigation came up short?
We have statutory authority to review these internal affairs investigations once they are complete. And if we find that there are deficiencies materially affecting the outcome, that's the standard set out in the law, we can recommend that those investigations be reopened. And that's what happened here. So we looked at this investigation into allegations that 8 CPD members associated with the Oath Keepers. The Bureau of Internal Affairs investigation did reveal evidence that all 8 accused members had at some point associated with the Oath Keepers. Nonetheless, CPD found no misconduct. We found a number of different deficiencies which we believe rise to that level of materially affecting the outcome, including the inadequacy of certain investigative steps, improper interviews where attorneys for the accused officers were allowed to interfere with the interviews, and probably most importantly, we found the same material deficiency here that we've found in other CPD investigations, where the police department has failed to conduct an adequate analysis of whether association with the Oath Keepers constitutes a violation of CPD's rules of conduct.
The 8 officers who were accused of belonging to the Oath Keepers, members of whom attacked the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol, on January 6th, we all know, were only interviewed on average for less than half an hour, on average. Longest interview was 48 minutes. What does that tell you?
That this is a deficient investigation. This is not an investigation which lives up to the department's commitment to take this issue seriously. That failure to live up to commitments is, I think, something we saw echoed from the mayor's office when, in a separate product that we published today, we recommended that the mayor convene a whole-of-government task force to address this issue of extremism in the police ranks. The mayor's office reiterated a commitment he has made to dealing with this issue, but declined to take any specific steps.
Do you suspect or do you have concerns that the department's own internal investigations unit, the BIA, that there are problems in those investigations that go beyond whether or not members have ties to groups such as these?
Whenever there are issues of investigative quality, that's a very troubling thing. Both members of the department and members of the public are entitled to a police disciplinary system in which everyone has reason to be confident. And wherever we see issues of investigative quality, we ought to take that very seriously. On this particular issue, the stakes are incredibly high. If the city and the police department are serious about fostering public trust, we simply have to get this right. We cannot ask people to trust a police department whose members are allowed to dabble in hatred and extremism.
Well, and to that point, given that the CPD has refused to reopen these investigations, what could be the ramifications for a department that already has a problem with trust, particularly in the Black and brown communities?
This is a public safety issue. The police cannot effectively keep people safe if people do not trust and cooperate with the police. And as I say, I do not think we can ask a police department, we can ask people to trust a police department which has not addressed this issue.
CPD says that none of the accused officers stated that they knew that the Oath Keepers were an extremist group, nor did they state that they had any intentions of joining a violent extremist group. CPD also says that none of the accused members were actively participating in the group. How can they be sure of that?
I'm not sure that they can from the investigation that they conducted.
Based on what you've seen of that investigation, you feel like there are a lot more questions that they did not answer.
That's correct.
On May 3rd, CPD Superintendent Larry Snelling said that the investigation was thorough and had, quote, reached out to everyone. Who else should they have reached out to? Because it sounds like they only interviewed the 8 officers in question.
Part of the challenge of doing this work is to identify these material deficiencies without kind of Monday morning quarterbacking the investigation. The fact of the matter is, the investigation on paper, the investigation that CPD conducted, I believe to be materially deficient.
Chicago Police Superintendent Larry Snelling has called it, quote, misleading to connect the probe into these Chicago police officers' ties with the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers to January 6th, saying that none of them knowingly knew that the groups were dedicated to violent far-right extremism. Is that a fair criticism of your call to fire these officers?
We've laid out the history of these groups in a number of different products. I think it is absolutely true that all along these groups have said what they are, and there is no reason to think any different.
No reason to think that the officers were not aware of the groups that they were signing up for. What were some of the reasons that they gave for joining these groups?
Officers talked about wanting discounts on certain things, wanting to learn about the Constitution of the United States, That strikes me as a disingenuous explanation for joining extremist and anti-government groups.
Your report also notes that the CPD has moved in the past to terminate officers with links to the Ku Klux Klan or street gangs, using the rule violation that you contend will allow officers with ties to right-wing extremist groups to be terminated. These groups can be categorized the same way?
Absolutely. CPD has recently taken the position that membership in a group like the Oath Keepers cannot constitute a rule violation. That's in contrast to the position CPD has taken with respect to street gangs, and it's in contrast to the position that CPD took 50 years ago when it applied this same rule to fire officers for associating with the Klan. If the rule is good enough for the Klan, it's good enough for the Oath Keepers.
Why do you think they're getting separate treatment?
I think the city has failed to meet its commitments here. We've called on CPD and the mayor to do more and to do better.
Your report also found that Mayor Johnson had fallen short of fulfilling his promise to root out extremism in the ranks. What should he do now?
He should get the stakeholders together. This is an issue that is too big and too important to expect a solution that just lives within the four walls of the police department. We need to be identifying and taking every opportunity across city recruiting and hiring and budgeting and training to prevent, detect, and eliminate extremism in the police ranks. That buck stops at City Hall.
Okay. IG Deborah Witzburg, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, our Spotlight Politics team on the first public hearing for a proposed merger of CTA, Metra, and Pace. Stay with us. It was standing room only at the first public hearing about dramatically changing how transit works in Chicago. Meanwhile, the Chicago Police Department is coming under fire, as we just heard, from the city's Inspector General, and Illinois Republicans will soon have a new party leader. Here with all that and more, Spotlight Politics team, Amanda Vinicky, Heather Sharon, Nick Plumberg. Welcome back, gang. So, Nick, let's start with you. Standing room only today, as we said, at the first of 6 scheduled public hearings to explore the possibility of merging the state's 3 transit agencies. The idea is to combine, of course, the CTA, Metra, and Pace into one super agency overseeing transit. Do we have details on what this might look like?
We've got some, outlines here, but as with things like this, they can always change. But the proposal is for something called the Metropolitan Mobility Authority. As you mentioned, it would combine, urban and near suburban bus and transit, train rather, commuter regional rail, suburban bus and paratransit under one roof. It would have a single board appointed by the governor, the mayor, and county board heads. The idea is better coordination, a single fare, improved services. Advocates say there would be efficiencies created by eliminating redundant jobs. And the big thing here is that this plan also calls for $1.5 billion in new funding. But yeah, as you can see from the video, a lot of interest, Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. in the summer, and we packed the room.
Good job, everybody. The heads of CTA, Metra, and Pace, they all address lawmakers today, pushing back on the merger idea, but echoing calls for significantly more funding. Here's what some of them had to say.
We're all in favor of doing what's best for the customer. We all want to do the best job we can. I do not believe that combining us into one organization will make us better.
For more than 40 years, the inadequacy of CTA's funding formula has been an open secret, with the can kicked down the road year after year and decade after decade.
We all may be victims of our own success. We do operate the leanest system in the country. We keep making it happen when we don't have the right resources.
So, Nick, what kind of reaction did agency heads get from lawmakers?
Well, State Senator Ram Velivalam, who is one of the backers of this legislation, said at the outset that agency leaders shouldn't expect more funding without reforms. Now, by the end of the hearing, he softened that a little bit, saying, if there is consensus, we'll move ahead with this merger legislation. If not, hey, maybe we could keep the status quo. But the focus was pretty squarely on making at least some reforms, if not a wholesale merger. They were asked, the agency leaders were asked, do you believe the report that came out late last year suggesting this as one of the ways forward for transit? And they said pretty squarely that we don't think combining the three of us into a single agency is the right idea. They were also asked about how they can better improve service and better coordinate without a merger. That's something they spent quite a bit of time talking about, things like the new day pass that allow people to ride CTA, Metra, and Pace for a single price, talking about things like bus rapid transit. But there's a lot of interest from lawmakers in tying that extra $1.5 billion or whatever the final number ends up being to some pretty significant reforms.
So one universal fare for a single pass that could be used with any of the three transit companies, of course, that is a significant change. What are the next steps when it comes to more reforms and, of course, funding?
As you can imagine, this is a huge lift. These are three very separate agencies with a lot of, bureaucracies and boards and plans and procedures and union contracts. There will be at least 5 more public hearings between now and October. What we've heard so far from political leaders, Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle is open to this idea. CTA President Dorval Carter today said at the hearing that he's had conversations with Mayor Johnson and city leaders, and they're of the opinion that governance isn't the problem, it's decades of chronic underfunding of transit. So because there's going to be this series of hearings, the legislation's been filed, but there's not going to be any movement on this, at least until the veto session at the earliest, and frankly, I'd be surprised if we saw a vote on this before the election in November.
Amanda's shaking her head because she knows these things.
No way before the election. That's not going to happen. That is, first of all, too big of a change to actually implement by then, but also that's politically risky. You have a lot of fiefdoms there, a lot of customers who are impacted. It's just not going to happen before the election.
Yeah, but at the same time, the clock is ticking because 2026, $730 million fiscal cliff that these three agencies are going to hit. So we're going to wait a while, but they can't wait too long.
Don't have too long to wait, like folks who are maybe waiting for a bus or a train.
Hey,
see what I did there? All right, so.
Been there.
Well, yeah, on its face, right? It sounds like a good idea. Like this might be more convenient for passengers, but obviously that remains in question. So we just heard from Chicago Inspector General Deborah Witzburg laying out her argument for why she believes the police department should reopen the investigation into 8 officers who have been found to have ties to far-right extremist groups. Heather, during the 2023 campaign, Brandon Johnson promised to fire CPD members with ties to these groups. Why hasn't he?
It's a good question. One, it's very difficult to fire Chicago police officers. There's a whole process you have to go through. And right now, I'm not sure there's actually a legal process to do it in a contested firing because, of course, the police board has to change its processes because of the change in arbitration and whether it's public or private, which is still in the appellate courts right now. But the overall question is that when you're a candidate, it's really easy to say, yeah, I'm going to fire bad cops. It's a lot harder when the rubber meets the road, and there are real questions about protecting these officers' First Amendment rights of assembly and sort of having their own political views. But the other side, as we heard Deborah Witzburg said, this is a public safety issue. Chicagoans, particularly Chicagoans of color and gay and LGBTQ, Chicagoans have real questions about these officers who belong to this group who sort of espouse a white supremacist approach to this nation, whether they can really be counted on to help them on the worst days of their lives. This is a fundamental question that Brandon Johnson is going to have to confront one way or the other.
You mentioned it being very difficult to fire Chicago Police Department. Obviously, they have what's considered a strong union that represents and protects them as well. Have we heard from the union, the police union, on this issue?
Well, we haven't because there's been no formal disciplinary process because we've had 3 separate investigations into officers with ties to the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and other. There's one still ongoing to another extremist group, the 3 Percenters. None of them has ever gotten to the point where the union would even get involved because none of the charges have been sustained. The question is, obviously, Superintendent Larry Snelling does not believe that simply sort of associating with these groups, sort of signing up for a mailing list, sort of saying, I want to join, is enough to terminate someone. I think that's an open question whether all of Chicago agrees that's how the police department should work.
Well, and also apparently, according to the IG, it's a question of whether or not that is fact and whether or not those are the only reasons those officers joined, since she finds their research to be insufficient at examining whether or not that's actually happened.
Very few people will admit to wrongdoing simply when asked in a disciplinary process.
Especially when your job is on the line.
Right. And so the question is, you know, Superintendent Snelling said these investigations were thorough and that he stood behind them. I think there are now real questions about the thoroughness of that investigation and real questions about why CPD has refused to sort of take Deborah Witzburg's criticism and sort of go back to the drawing board. In each of the previous 2 investigations of extremist cops, they did go back to the drawing board, and in one case an officer agreed to a suspension of 120 days, and the other investigation, nothing changed.
Okay, less than a week until Republicans descend upon Milwaukee. The folks at this table will be there, except for me, just 90 minutes away from where we are right now. Amanda, are things as chaotic for the Republicans as they are for the Democrats?
I was going to say less than a week until we descend
until you
Milwaukee
descend, yes.
and report all that goes on there for our Chicago Tonight viewers. I don't know that things are quite as chaotic. I'm not in Milwaukee yet, so we will again soon find out.
Next week.
Of course, there are a lot of questions as to who is going to be President Donald Trump's running mate. We don't know. Does he know and he's just not saying, or does he not even know at this point? I think that is, at this point, the big outstanding question. I'm not sure that I would describe that, however, as chaos, because many of the people, if you're a delegate for Donald Trump, I don't think you really give much of a hoot who the running mate is. These are the Trump faithful. I was going to say party faithful. It is beyond that. They are the Trump faithful, and they are there for him, not the running mate.
Well, and especially given the rotten last week and a half that Biden and the Democrats have had, I don't think that the Trump campaign sees it as being in their political self-interest to come out with a big splashy announcement.
Why change the news now?
Exactly. Let this play out. Let it happen.
Let someone flail. And, why would you want to take the heat off of Biden at this point?
If you're the Republicans, right. Illinois Republican Party, meanwhile, expected to have new leadership by the end of the week. That is following state GOP chairperson Don Tracy resigning just over 2 weeks ago. Amanda, are you hearing rumblings about who might be chosen to lead?
Well, so yeah, there is a closed-door meeting on Friday where they could make a decision. It might not be settled by then who the next chair of the party will be. They're at least, however, going to hear from the handful of individuals that we believe are putting their hat in for that job. It is very much a difficult job because you have a party that is frankly quite splintered, and we're seeing those divisions come to the fore, including with Tracy's resignation. So we've got a couple of names there. For example, a couple of members of the General Assembly. One that seems to be gaining some traction is downstate Senator Jason Plummer, who had previously run for lieutenant governor. There is a Republican out of Palatine who'd previously led the Cook County GOP, Aaron Del Mar. We don't know who all is going to be making their pitch. And again, all eyes on that, though, because it comes at such a pivotal time, obviously, again, with the RNC just next week.
Seems like the kind of thing you'd want to have lined up before you head to Milwaukee next week. I'm no expert, but okay, so you mentioned the Democrats flailing. Today, Governor J.B. Pritzker told reporters that he is all in on Biden.
I'm not engaging in any hypotheticals. You can see that I'm all in for Joe Biden. Joe Biden's going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. I'm going to go out there and wholeheartedly campaign for him. I've endorsed him and Kamala Harris. He's going to be at the convention in August accepting the nomination, and I'll be cheering for him in the audience.
All right, so the Democrats have some issues. Questions, as we've discussed, remain over whether or not Biden can remain or will, in fact, become the Democratic nominee. Congressman Mike Quigley from Illinois, though, saying that the president's interviews over the weekend did nothing to reassure him. Amanda, where are other Illinois Democrats in terms of their support for Biden? Do we know?
Quigley is really the only one that has openly called, at least prominent Illinois Democrat, who has said that he wants Biden out of the race and believes that the president cannot win another term. You just heard from the governor there, clearly taking the opposite tack. Of course, you are not expecting Governor Pritzker to do anything but that. He is one of the top surrogates for the campaign. What I thought was interesting, that clip that we actually heard was actually in response to a question asking, okay, so another name that's often on this short list of the what if Biden drops out is Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And she has said, No, that she, even if Biden does drop out of the race, she would not be the nominee. Asked Governor Pritzker whether he would say the same, and he demurred right there, as we heard, calling it a hypothetical. He says, in the line of questioning, reporters really hounding him a lot, he said that he doesn't think that this is going to happen. He does not expect there to be a brokered DNC. But again, I think that is a big takeaway. He is not ruling out the possibility that he would be on some sort of White House ticket should the opportunity arise.
Also a little bit awkward for him because isn't he sort of participating in the hosting of the DNC? And so it would look a little uncomfortable if it got to that when the DNC goes down.
Could look bad.
Well, it might look a little bad. All right, that is Spotlight. Looking forward to next week, gang. Thank you so much, Amanda Vinicky, Heather Sharon, Nick Blumberg. And of course, make Chicago Tonight your home for the RNC next week. Join us live at 5:30 and 10 each convention night. We will have live coverage with the folks you just heard from here from Milwaukee and analysis before and after PBS NewsHour. And that is our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10. A new book explores alternative ways to confront the issue of mass incarceration. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.